Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining TransCelerate's webinar today. Our topic today is our process management framework, providing some guidance to successful implementation of processes in clinical development. And I am sharing my screen, so everyone should see some slides. So as we get started, I'd like to introduce the TransCelerate team that will be speaking to you today. We have Mike Husovich on the line, Director of Quality Operations at Amgen. Carol Southwood, Senior Manager of Quality and Compliance Risk Management at Amgen. Odette Aniangwe, Head of Quality and Operations and Processes and Procedures at Roche. And Laura Lee Zoller-Nooner, Senior Quality Document Manager at Sanofi. My name is Gloria McHugh, and I'll be your operations lead today. And if you have any trouble in terms of technical issues or feedback, you can send an email to events@transceleratebiopharmainc.com. I'll be monitoring that offline as we go through the presentations. So as we get started, in terms of logistics for today's webinar, all the participants are muted for today's call. You can either use your computer or a phone to listen to the presentations, and I'd like to suggest if you feel like you're having audio quality issues, you should hang up and dial back in using another method. Sometimes that can resolve it. The GoToWebinar control panel that you see on the right side of your screen, you can reduce that for a better view of the presentation by clicking on the orange and white arrow. And if you click it again, it'll bring the control panel back. So the two main functions in your control panel are the audio and questions. We'll be using that questions panel for you to submit questions to our presenters. So just type your question in and then click send. We'll also be using live polling during today's webinar to make it interactive. All participation is completely voluntary and your responses will be anonymous. Your answers will only be shared as a percentage of respondents. So we're going to go ahead and test the polling function right now. So Heather, if you can launch that first poll. The poll is open. Can everyone see the poll? I'm not seeing it, Heather. All right, it looks like some folks are voting, so maybe it's just my screen that can't be seen. All right, so thank you for voting, and you can go ahead and share the poll results. And it looks like 52% of the people who voted have blue as their favorite color. So thanks everyone for voting. All right, I'd like to also cover some ground rules for TransCelerate today before we get started. So again, participation is voluntary, as is using any TransCelerate assets or tools. You don't have to identify what company you work for, but you can if you want. Specific topics that we would ask you not to discuss would be any vendors, sites, or CROs that you're using or not using, any issues or problems you've had with vendors, sites, or CROs, your long-term development plans, or anything related to costs. We really can't answer any questions about vendors, costs of using or implementing TransCelerate assets or tools, or which member companies are using the assets and tools. So our agenda today, I'll take us through a little bit of a TransCelerate overview and our QMS framework, and then I'll hand it over to a couple of speakers who will cover in detail our process management framework. We'll have a short Q&A, and then we'll cover more detail around the process toolkit and scenarios, and then we'll spend the last 15 minutes doing Q&A and audience polling questions. We will be making the recording of this webinar and all of the slides available after the webinar. And the materials that we'll be covering today are all available on our website for free. We'll be covering the processes manuscript, our toolkit for implementing processes, and process scenarios. All right, so a little bit of an overview about TransCelerate. TransCelerate is a not-for-profit entity that was created to foster collaboration and to help improve the efficiency of clinical trials for the ecosystem to benefit sites, patients, and sponsors. The current state of our organization, we were founded in 2012 with 10 member companies. And today we have 20 member companies. We have more than 25 initiatives, including 4 pharmacovigilance initiatives. And because of the breadth and depth of our initiatives about enhancing industry collaboration and really facilitating future platforms, we feel we're really contributing to improving the ecosystem of clinical research. The reach of our global membership is expanding. As I said, we have 20 member companies, and at any given time, we have more than 1,000 people from those 20 member companies participating across those 25 initiatives. Our presence, impact, and engagement worldwide is also expanding. We have a country network that spans 30 countries, and to date, we've interacted with more than 13 global regulatory authorities across many of our initiatives to make sure that we are engaging the regulatory authorities about the work that we're doing. So getting more into our quality management system framework. So the processes framework is a part of our quality management system framework. At a very high level, a clinical QMS is an integrated framework through which organizations can systematically define their quality objectives, linking that to their broader strategic goals. The purpose of a clinical QMS is multifaceted. It's looking to efficiently achieve an organization's quality and organizational objectives, looking to reduce recurring quality-related issues that can undermine patient safety and data integrity. We're looking to increase confidence in clinical research and its results by continuing to advocate for a clinical QMS, and also looking to integrate individual trial-level quality and risk management activities to provide a more holistic view of whether clinical quality objectives are being met and risks to subjects and data quality are being appropriately addressed across the enterprise. So the TransCelerate's clinical QMS conceptual framework looks like this. Our framework includes elements that we found help to contribute to success in the clinical arena. It is designed to be proactive, risk-based, and flexible. And you can see that there are 7 blue bars representing the 7 elements that help integrate quality into clinical development activities. There are 4 elements at the base of the diagram. Those are what we consider our foundational aspects for a sponsor to consider as they implement a QMS. And also the 2 elements going vertically on the right are really to help provide ongoing monitoring of the achievement of quality objectives and the performance of a QMS. So this table illustrates also how our TransCelerate CQMS conceptual framework aligns with the current ICH revision 2. You can see on the left we have listed a number of sections from ICH E6R2, the specific language that calls out particulars of a QMS. And then you can see in the middle column, we've aligned that with our QMS element. And also we have a number of different operational tools that again are free on our website for you to use to help assess different aspects of your QMS. So this slide is designed to show you again the different elements and the different publications that we have completed since 2016 to support these different elements and foundational aspects of what TransCelerate has designed as the conceptual framework for QMS. And again, these are all available on our website. And to date, we have more than 28,000 downloads of these, and a number of them have Chinese translations as well. And with that, I will hand it over to Mike Husovich and Carol Southwood to walk us through the details of the process management framework.
Thank you, Gloria. Good day, everyone. Next slide, please. So as Gloria mentioned, there is a publication out there available for use. The publication is entitled The Process Management Framework and really provides a guidance to successful implementation of that element called processes, as Gloria described. And this is available on the TransCelerate website. Next slide, please. So we got a couple polling questions to get a sense of our audience. The first question is, how aware of the TransCelerate process management manuscript and tools are you? All right, we have some results in. We got half or more that are somewhat or very aware, and a little less than half that are not aware at all. Good. That's helpful for us today. Second polling question is, how mature do you consider process management in your organization? Okay, interesting. So here we have maybe 80%, a little more, somewhat mature, very mature, very good. All right. So moving on, defining our terms, processes. When we talk about processes, what do we mean by that? It's really understanding the steps an organization carries out to complete a clinical development activity and determining whether and to what degree these steps should be documented, and importantly, determining the most effective training to ensure consistent and compliant process outcomes. We think that's important, and it provides value in terms of focusing on end-to-end processes and providing greater assurance of customer and regulatory expectations, making sure our documentation strategy and amount of documentation is commensurate with the level of risk, and importantly, addressing the modern day learner and making sure that staff are best equipped to perform their tasks. Next slide, please. So before we get into the framework we're going to show you around processes, it's worth our time to spend a little bit to talk about the shift in organizational culture when we talk about going from a conventional structure to a process-driven. So a functional or convention approach to managing an organization can be siloed, as they are structured and measured by individual department goals and objectives. Although executive leaders operate as a team, they're focused on their individual functions. A process or customer-driven approach to managing an organization, however, focuses on cross-functional processes and their associated capabilities. These organizations realize that products and services for customers are not produced by the department or function necessarily, but by the processes that span across functions. In our industry, the patient is the final and most important customer. However, there are also multiple internal and external customers of our processes. Prior to beginning any large change initiative, such as moving from a functional or conventional-driven approach to a process-driven approach, careful consideration should be given to effective leadership commitment, engagement, active participation, and advocacy of process management. A process or customer-driven approach, we believe, has a few advantages, including accountability by focusing on overcoming functional silos through single points of process accountability, quality and compliance by enabling right first-time operations to improve quality and reduce risk, and speed, providing end-to-end performance management and sightline to the customer. Next slide. So this is the process management framework, we're calling it. It is the foundation for the process management manuscript and the tools that we'll be covering today. And we kind of have four sort of pillars, as we call them. I'll be covering the first one here as we speak. It's define and characterize processes. By that, we mean a couple of things: identifying the high-level end-to-end process landscape, identify and establish an owner, map and modeling a process, determining process risk, evaluating potential for process automation, and identifying process measures and controls. Next slide, please. So we think about where do we start, and clear process identification, ownership, and accountabilities are fundamental to ensuring high-performing processes. The first step to implement processes is to understand the end-to-end process landscape. This is a fundamental and challenging first step as organizations move from a function-driven approach to a process-driven approach. One way to accomplish this is by identifying the core end-to-end processes the sub-processes, and the enabling processes within a clinical development area. A core process can be defined as a set of cross-functional value-added activities or steps that deliver a specific output that has a profound impact on delivering strategic business objectives, either directly or indirectly. Key sub-processes constitute the sum of the core processes. Enabling processes do not necessarily belong to any one core or sub-process, but are essential for conducting the operation. People with overall responsibility and expertise for each process should be assigned as business process owners, or BPOs, to act as a single point of ownership for each process. For example, the process of starting a clinical study can be considered an end-to-end core process, while site evaluation and selection, site setup and initiation, and global study startup are considered sub-processes, and processes such as staff training and qualification, vendor and supplier management, and risk management meet the definition of enabling processes. In this case, 7 BPOs would be needed and assigned for each of the processes, 1 for each process, irrespective of whether they are core, key, sub, or enabling. Next slide, please. Effective process mapping is more than just a flow chart of activities. Effective process mapping and modeling ensures that processes are defined correctly to articulate the desired business outcome or deliverable. Methodology for process mapping should be standardized to ensure consistency. The methodology for process mapping may include the following activities: assembling business process owners and subject matter experts, ensuring the key stakeholders who provide inputs or receive outputs of the process are engaged to provide or understand customer requirements of the process, developing an initial suppliers, inputs, process, output, customers, or SIPOC diagram is a great place to start. The SIPOC is a process management tool from Six Sigma practices. This basic diagram begins to shift the process or to process or customer-driven thinking. The goal of the map is to provide a high-level understanding of the process, its boundaries, and the scope. From the initial high-level SIPOC diagram, teams can create a more detailed process map. One type of process map that can be useful at this stage is a swim lane or activity flow diagram. A swim lane activity diagram is especially useful to depict the roles and the handoffs that normally occur in the process. Identifying handoffs in the process is particularly useful, as handoffs often represent opportunities for errors and inefficiencies. Next slide, please. Now that we've characterized our landscape and have a sense of our process and what it looks like, now we can begin to determine process risk. So critical processes in clinical development must be identified, characterized consistently in terms of risk to protection of human subjects, data integrity, reliability of trial results, and meeting quality objectives. Specific to clinical trials, this requirement is described in the recent update to ICAG 6R2, which states the sponsor should identify those processes and data that are critical to ensure human subject protection and reliability of trial results. Not all processes in clinical development have the same level of risk. Therefore, the level of controls to reduce or avoid the risk must be in place and should be commensurate with the level of risk. Processes that pose greater risks have levels of control to reduce or avoid these risks. Actions to reduce risk include increasing detectability through monitoring, metrics, and controlled documentation. Actions to avoid risk include removing the source of risk, redesigning a process, and implementing error-proofing techniques. A predetermined and fit-for-purpose risk evaluation framework should be defined and leveraged as part of effective process management. A model risk management framework has been described in TransCelerate's risk management concept paper. Applying this framework can ensure consistent identification, assessment, and control of identified process risks. Next slide, please. It's worth noting when we talk about processes, the importance of identifying process measures and controls. So establishing the correct process performance measures and controls is a fundamental and necessary to ensure the process is working as designed and has objective evidence for evaluating performance and driving continuous improvement. At a minimum, Identifying and implementing effective process measures should include, number one, a clear definition of what is critical to quality from the customer perspective and how to consistently measure it. Number two, agreed performance targets. And number three is ownership for that performance of that metric. The SIPOC diagram, as we covered earlier, is a good place to begin to identify effective metrics for a process. By using the SIPOC diagram as a starting point, one can identify the process outputs and the customers who receive those outputs to define what success looks like and what the process measures and targets should be. Another key concept regarding metrics and driving process improvements is the discussion surrounding primary, lagging, or outcome metrics versus secondary, leading, or causal metrics. Primary metrics are those metrics directly associated with the output of the process that is important to the customer. Secondary metrics are associated with the input or process activities that are causal to those outputs. As a rule of thumb, primary process measures in clinical development should address time, cost, and quality. Time measures can be less difficult to define. For example, cycle time from when a study documentation is completed until regulatory approval is obtained, and time from when first subject is enrolled until the time recruitment is completed. These parameters can be measured in terms of cost as well, cost for a company to initiate sites, cost to complete the recruitment of the study, and cost to if the recruitment is delayed and additional sites and countries need to be added. Quality measures, however, can sometimes be more difficult to measure. Generally, quality measures should be associated with right first time and conformance to requirements. For example, study documentation completeness, on-time reporting to external authorities, and the number of data errors as are reviewed as part of quality. Next slide, please. So to cover our second pillar, I'd like to hand it over to Carol Southwood.
Thank you. So now we'll review the second pillar of the process management framework, which is determine process documentation strategy. So the topics we'll discuss are beginning with the process map, identifying processes requiring controlled documentation, identifying managed information required for performance, aligning documentation to end-to-end process and documentation hierarchy, and communicating process change. Next slide, please. Thank you. The first step in determining an effective documentation strategy is to review the process maps, process risk, and quality objectives to determine which processes require control documentation versus managed information. Generally, the level of controlled documentation for any clinical development process should be commensurate with the risks of the activity and the significance of the activity to achieving quality objectives and meeting stakeholder requirements. A QMS is considered both a source of truth that provides a complete picture of the process and a system of record that is used for audit or regulatory reporting purposes. Controlled documentation is part of a QMS. An example would be a policy or an SOP. Managed information provides important information and knowledge required to perform the process right first time. Its success is tied in part to the strength of an organization's knowledge management system and process. An example of managed information is lessons learned that are kept on common company shared platforms for sharing across study teams. Next slide, please. Thank you. It is essential that processes and activities for controlled documentation and managed information are aligned to both the end-to-end process and the correct documentation hierarchy. To ensure consistent classification of documentation types and alignment to an overall documentation hierarchy, a documentation hierarchy should be defined and standardized. In clinical development, it's common to have both controlled documentation and managed information for a given process. For example, an SOP, or controlled documentation, on study monitoring describes what must be done and who is responsible for it. The how aspect might be described or presented in a different format and media, such as interactive presentations or videos, as best practice solutions or managed information, which are recommended but allow modifications when there is a business need. Next slide. Clear communication is key to effective implementation. Prior to control documentation being assigned to staff, targeted email messages are often used to communicate recently developed or revised documentation to end users. The message may include items such as a list of new or updated documents that have been released, canceled or obsolete documents, applicability to a particular audience, reasons for creation, update, or cancellation, date of release, update, or cancellation, and the effective dates, considerations for implementation, training information, and course details. Email communication should be stored, ideally, in an official process documentation repository, so it's easily accessible to end users that are implementing the change. Next slide. Thank you. So now we'll jump over to the third pillar, which is drive flawless execution through learning approach. As part of this pillar, we'll review selecting the learning method and time, selecting the learning approach for controlled and managed information, and managing training volume and avoiding cognitive overload. Next slide. It's important to select the learning delivery based on organizational culture, documentation, knowledge required, experience, and target size of the audience, and complexity of the process. There are various learning methods, including read and apply, virtual or face-to-face classroom instructor-led e-learning, and video. There may need to be a period of mentoring and on-the-job training before confirming the employee is qualified to independently execute a particular process. New trends in learning involve gamification, that is applying gaming designs and concepts to learning or training scenarios, augmented or virtual reality, meaning putting the learner directly in a real or simulated learning environment, and software technology. Importantly, our world and how people learn and interact with technology continues to evolve, and our industry needs to evaluate and embrace these methods and technologies. Considerations should also be given to determining the delivery method and timing of the training. To be most effective, training should be assigned close to the moment of execution, usually called just-in-time training. Although just-in-time training may be most effective, it requires significant effort and oversight from line managers to assign training in line with scheduled activities. A learning management tool can be anything from a Microsoft Excel matrix to a more automated learning management system. Learning management tools support organizations in assigning training or retraining to individuals per their specified roles, capturing training evidence and training evidence outcomes, and providing oversight on the training status of the workforce. Next slide. Thank you. In this slide, we demonstrate how mandatory training on controlled documentation is pushed to the user through automatic delivery. Mandatory training includes learning modules that are considered critical for job execution. This type of training requires the user to demonstrate effective training prior to executing job-related tasks. We also see how voluntary training on managed information is pulled by the user from knowledge centers or other shared areas. Voluntary training can be requested by users when there's a need or interest. Next slide. Thank you. Learning modules must allow learners to understand the full process end-to-end and understand their specific role and responsibilities in that process. To avoid cognitive overload, training for any individual person should focus on the elements related to the person's specific role and an overall understanding of the end-to-end process, but avoid including detailed training for all roles. Ongoing learning after onboarding should be focused on new elements, changes in high-risk elements of processes. Complex tasks or critical deliverables are associated with high risks and require sufficient attention during training. The more experienced personnel gain while executing company processes, the less the need for standard retraining. While continuing to train on changed or new elements in the processes, proficiency can be tested through knowledge and skill checks against pre-established expected proficiency levels. A successful knowledge check can replace standard retraining of an individual or on unchanged processes. Retraining is only required if proficiency is not demonstrated during the knowledge check. Automation reduces or eliminates the need to read, memorize, or internalize either the sequence of different steps or the criteria for decision-making at certain decision points. Criteria for decision-making can be built in, guiding the executor consistently through the same path under the same conditions. However, it's important that learners continue to think critically, do not become too reliant on the automated process, and continue to understand the end-to-end process. So with that, I'm passing it back to Mike for the fourth pillar. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Carol. So the fourth pillar is monitor and improve process performance. I'm going to cover these three components of it. The first is evaluating the process performance as part of management review. Second is assessing the impact of ongoing process changes. And the third is completing periodic review of process. Next slide, please. So management review is a vital part of the QMS to ensure the QMS is fit for purpose and operating as intended. A central component of management review is engaging senior management in the evaluation of processes to ensure they are fit for purpose and performing as intended, so that actions can be taken and resources can be provided to improve processes as needed. Process metrics or key performance indicators need to be established as objective ways to measure quality and compliance health. These metrics should be consistently reviewed and presented by the associated business process owners during management review. As an example, the completion of corrective and preventive actions is a fundamental aspect of the QMS and process ownership. Metrics should be established to ensure CAPAs are completed on time and effective in reducing or eliminating recurrence of issues. Next slide, please. Assessing the impact of ongoing process changes. A change or revision to a process should be assessed to ensure that proposed process change is warranted. Before developing processes and procedural documents to mitigate a risk, the organization should verify that this action will meaningfully reduce the risk or eliminate the root cause. Generally, processes and procedural documentation should be created or modified primarily for the following reasons: to address changes in underlying processes, for example, process improvements, address evolving customer requirements, such as health authority requirements, address changes identified by audit findings, or mitigate risks to quality objectives. If the process change is warranted, the organization assesses the impact of the change to accomplish the following: have an understanding of the overall impact of the process change may have on upstream or downstream processes, identify conflicting or overlapping priorities associated with the change, and provide resource and commitment for the change projects. Next slide, please. So monitoring and improving the process, periodic review is part of that. Periodic review of individual processes should take place as part of a proactive company culture to ensure processes remain fit for purpose and in compliance with regulations. Information from issue management, for example, trends and issues, should be evaluated to determine if issues can be alleviated through process redesign and/or development, revision, or retirement of specific procedural documents. Knowledge management and risk management activities should also play a role to identify changes that warrant reevaluation of processes and associated documents that could be retired, simplifying the procedural documentation infrastructure. In addition, process performance metrics and trends should be evaluated. The periodic review of processes should occur on a predetermined schedule, for example, every year or up to every 3 years, depending on the process. Next slide, please. So I think now in our agenda, we're taking a few minutes to receive any questions and answers based upon the 4 pillars of the framework that Carol and I covered.
Thanks, Mike. A question just came in regarding training. So, Carol, could you speak a little bit to how TransCelerate companies have handled just-in-time training and what your recommendations would be?
Am I still on mute, or can you hear me?
You are on mute.
You.
Okay, good. Sorry. So the question, just to make sure I understood, was how to handle just-in-time training and some examples of that. Did I understand that?
Yeah, the question is about handling just-in-time training successfully.
Yeah. So, so like I said, to provide training at the point of execution allows users to utilize the information sort of most effectively, but of course that's requires a fair amount of oversight from line managers. So some successful examples of that I've seen is really understanding where training overlays with the process itself. And part of what we're going to cover, Odette and Laura Lee are going to cover in the toolkit is how best to align those activities so that training is understood at the point of execution. So more to come on that example.
Great, thank you. Question for you, Mike. Do you have any specific recommendations regarding the QMS processes as they are implemented for biotech? Are there any differences?
Yeah, well, let me make sure I understand that question. So we have the TransCelerate QMS framework that's focused on clinical development versus GMP, but is the question specifically around biotech, or I'm not sure if I understand the question, sorry.
So the question came through simply asking if there's specific recommendations regarding the QMS processes for biotechs. Are there any differences between the QMS that we would have for pharma or CROs versus biotech?
Yeah, good. I think I understand the intent of the question, and maybe I'll add to it as well. I think we've learned through the TransCelerate engagement with health authorities and industry that the QMS, as it's represented in the research and development space or in the clinical development space, is different. It serves different purposes and has different regulations, and that's really the drive behind the TransCelerate framework and concept paper. In terms of so what that means is that any company, as you have commercial products or operations and GMP, what you do in the GMP space from a QMS perspective may look different than what you're doing in the clinical development space based on the associated regulations. Maybe behind that question is also, where do we start? The TransCelerate QMS framework has a bunch of elements and foundational aspects to it. We know where do we start, and I think if that's part of the question, you would want to start with a risk-based approach to make sure your issue management is under control before you advance to some of the other elements.
Thanks, Mike. Another question has come in for you, Mike. Do you consider the process maps themselves to be part of your QMS?
That's a good question. We consider the controlled documentation as the source of truth for our processes and how we comply with the law and follow them. We value the process maps as a characterization of the process, the primary activities, the roles, to make sure, as we mentioned earlier, that the processes are characterized well enough. And they're stored in a business process management system, we treat them as assets with valuable metadata so that we can understand the relationships of processes to one another. But in terms of staff training and regulation audits and inspections, the control documentation currently is our source of truth for our processes as they're rendered. The process maps are also, by the way, referenced in our control documentation, and our particular type of overview diagram is also added to our control documentation. So there's a little bit of a hybrid in the control documentation itself.
Great, thanks. And Carol, I think we'll take this last question for now and then transition to our next section, and then come back to some more of the questions that have come in. So the question that is here is, so by using processes as additional guidance on the how you get something done, you can't have all information in one place. And so you still need to have guidance in addition to the SOPs, etc. Can you elaborate on how to match the controlled information and the managed information to avoid repetition and maintain compliance?
Sure. So ideally, the document structure is commensurate with risk of a given process. So, you know, for example, and we'll get into a little bit of this in the tool, the specifics of it. But for a high-risk process, we would certainly have an SOP, for example, and you may also have managed information, a job aid, for example. And those things are available to staff in a validated environment or a knowledge hub and specific to the process. For a low-risk process, you know, there would be a need for managed information, but maybe not an SOP at a high-level controlled document. So we'll talk about in the toolkit how risk and the documentation hierarchy align, and how to sort of scale the documentation strategy as a result of that.
Yeah, Carol, if I could just add, that's a very good question, I think, posed, and I think represents a challenge for all of us. And just as you said, Carol, I think the documentation hierarchy and that pyramid that Carol showed, showing the controlled and managed, and the definitions of those associated information and document types need to be adhered to. And when they're not, we have a risk of proliferation of information. So I think that's a good question, and as Carol said, that I think we're going to describe that a little bit more in the upcoming toolkit.
Thank you both. We have some more questions, but I'll hold them until after we've reviewed the tool, and then we can come back to additional questions.
Odette, did you want to kick us off with the process toolkit and scenarios?
Absolutely. Thanks, Gloria. Hello, everyone. Could you move to the next slide, please? The toolkit was developed to help facilitate the implementation of the process framework in clinical organizations. Select steps from the processes development framework were identified to support the practical application of concepts described in the paper to ensure consistent and robust application of the concepts. Detailed instructions, examples, and templates are provided to assist clinical development organizations to implement a processes framework, identify how the processes should be documented based on their assessed risks, and how a learning management plan can support the clinical development organization, implement processes and documentation requirements. Please move to the next slide, Gloria. The figure above highlights the steps from the process management framework, which have further instructions, examples, and templates throughout the toolkit. Next slide, Gloria. So how to use the toolkit. The first step to using the toolkit is to read the manuscript to ensure effective implementation of processes. Then find the corresponding tool and examples throughout the toolkit. Each of the steps in the framework are sequenced and build upon one another. For this reason, an understanding of each of the steps is fundamental. Each of the steps highlighted in the toolkit correspond to a section of this toolkit and are color-coded to match the high-level phase of the process management framework. Each section is numbered and contains the following information. So the even pages give instructions for completing the tool with an example, while the odd pages is interactive tool template that really moves through each of the tool steps on the subsequent pages. A single example, and we've used Study Startup, was used in each of the corresponding sections to provide an end-to-end example. Do note, really, in the interest of simplicity, the toolkit examples, and except for section 1, which is identify high-level process, only show the additional sub-processes. Please move to the next slide, Gloria. Step 1 is identify high-level process. In this step, the end-to-end process is identified by mapping core processes, sub-processes, and enabling processes. The step is important because it helps the user to understand the end-to-end process landscape, which is needed to clearly identify the process ownership, and accountabilities, which are fundamental to ensure high-performing processes. The output and benefit of this step is proper process identification so as to ensure a process-driven approach. An example using Study Startup is provided on the left, while the interactive template has been provided on the right. Please move to the next slide, Gloria. Step 2 is map and model process. In this step, we use a SIPOC, which is made up of the following parts. So supplier, who is the provider of the critical quality inputs, input, which is resources required by the process, process, which is scalable to any level within the process area, output, which is the deliverables from the process, customers, which is anyone who received a deliverable or output from the process. The SIPOC helps to define and characterize processes by capturing metadata. Metadata consists of key process roles, process inputs, outputs, interdependencies, and related documentation. The goal of this is to provide a high-level understanding of the process as it relates to the customer and what the process requires as inputs. It establishes the scope of the process, helps to identify key areas and stakeholders of the process so as to drive business deliverables and performance. We've continued to use the Study Startup example where the SIPOC really drills down into site setup and initiation. The benefit of this is process characterization leads to an understanding of upstream requirements as well as downstream deliverables. Move to the next slide, please. Step 3 is determine process risk. In this step, risks for processes are determined by completing an assessment concerning business risk, process complexity risk, and process operational risk. These risks are important to assess since they support the protection of human subjects, data integrity, reliability of trial results, and meeting our quality objectives. Specific to clinical trials, this requirement is described in the recent update to ICH A6R2, which states the sponsor should identify those processes and data that are critical to ensure human subject protection and reliability of trial results. Since not all processes in the clinical development landscape have the same level of risk, it is recommended that the level of controls to reduce or avoid the risk be in place, and they should be commensurate with the level of risk. The goal of this step is to identify the process risk, which is used to help determine the documentation strategy, which is described, and I'll go through that in the next slide. Thank you. Step 4 is documentation strategy. In this step, the processes that require controlled documentation, so which describes really the business and the process and business requirements, versus managed information, which is processes described at level of execution, are determined based on the process risk score. The documentation strategy is important since it helps to ensure that documentation represents the actual process. That documentation is easy to understand and follow and has the right level of controls and quality oversight and is consistent from one process to the next. We've continued to use the study startup example in this step, where we show that both controlled, so for example, SOPs and managed information, and in this case, we could say job aids, is used. Managed information is used when key roles, systems, and activities need to be described to support controlled documentation. At this point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Laura Lee, who will take us through the next parts.
Gloria, can you advance the slide? Okay. Step 5 is learning approach. Following the risk score and assessment of control documentation versus managed information requirements, we can prepare a holistic learning plan. This is important because the learning plan supports the organizational culture, documentation, knowledge required, experience and target size of audience, and complexity of the process. To select a learning method and to manage training overload, we've provided a template that allows you to align process, documentation, or information requirements with corresponding training. Another key aspect to this tool is a user guide for learning plan considerations that enable the user to ensure documentation or information isn't redundant with existing content to ultimately improve performance and the user experience. We know that managed information can reside in a knowledge hub with business oversight, and in the case of self-directed learning, the two can look almost, if not entirely, identical. As such, these checks are critical for just-in-time training. The user guide also incorporates consideration to the modern adult learner so that the learning utilizes emerging technology where appropriate, such as simulation, video, virtual classrooms, gamification, WalkMe, or e-documents, which may better meet the needs for mobility, modularized learning, continued education, and varied formats. Additionally, the tool provides a structure that aligns with a document strategy to determine where training or learning resides in terms of push versus pull, required or as needed training. Below, in this example, we've continued showing the study startup process, which includes the risk score and document strategy requirements from the previous steps that are used to help build the learning plan. Next slide, Gloria. Step 6 is management review. In this step, the process health performance is evaluated as part of management review by defining line of sight goals, metrics, roles, frequency, and forum. We begin by starting with the highest level process and work left to right to complete the table. Then define the process goals, critical to quality metrics, which again are time, cost, and quality, roles responsible to review the metrics, frequency, which is how often the information is to be reviewed, forum, and focus, which is what activities are to be reviewed. After the table is complete for the high-level process, we repeat for each of the sub-processes. This step is important since it helps to ensure a QMS is fit for purpose and operated as intended. Next slide. So now we'll talk about our other asset, which is the process management framework scenarios. This was developed with examples to illustrate how an effective process management framework can ensure the efficient and effective delivery of clinical development programs. Each scenario is presented in 4 parts. We begin with the scenario description. Second is its business impact. Third is the possible process management solutions. And fourth is the potential process management benefits to help readers understand the real and potential benefits to a robust process management program. Next slide. And here we provide the examples of scenarios. They were built to help users understand how elements of the framework can be implemented in their own organizations by providing practical examples of how organizations can apply the process management framework. The framework acts as the what, with its scenarios giving examples of the how. Next slide. In this first scenario on selecting an organizational structure, an example is provided to demonstrate how an organizational structure should be selected before undertaking other activities. This is described in the process management framework paper. However, we felt it was important to include in the scenarios as well, because implementing this framework requires a fundamental shift in how a company takes a traditional approach to processes and shifts it to a customer-driven approach. Next slide. In scenario 5 on controlled versus managed documents, it provides an example of an organization that has no documented methodology for determining if the process content should be in a controlled or managed document. By using the risk scoring methodology from the toolkit, the organization can very quickly assess the risk of a given process and make a data-driven assessment to determine the appropriate document type. This is especially useful in audit and inspection scenarios where such decisions might be challenged, and an inspector would be looking to see evidence of this kind of risk-based assessment. The risk scoring methodology also allows for the organization to put in place quality and compliance controls around a process that are commensurate to the risk as assessed using this tool. Next slide. In this slide, we provide some key takeaway messages. So the first is the process management framework represents an integral part of an effective QMS. Common understanding of the steps required for implementation can provide a greater organizational success in implementing process management in a robust way. Successful process management implementation will help to identify and define key and critical processes associated with clinical development, provide clear and concise procedural documentation that are consistent and fit for purpose to support effective staff training, allow staff to excel at executing the process right the first time, which is really a must-have for today's competitive landscape. Next slide, and I'll pass this to you, Gloria.
Right. Thanks, everyone. Great presentations. So before we get into our more extended Q&A section, I'd like to just show the resources that are available. Again, all TransCelerate resources are available for free on our website. You would navigate to the Quality Management System assets. On the left side of the screen is a layout of our website, and you can see at the bottom we have a number of the elements, and you would click on the arrows to open those, and then you'll see the different assets that we've been discussing here are all available there, and these are live links. And again, the slides will be sent out in a few days with a link to the recording of today's session. So Odette, Laura Lee, Mike, and Carol, we have a number of incoming questions that Mary's been putting into the chat for you to take a look at. But at this time, Mary, would you like to read out the first question that we're going to address?
Sure, thanks, Gloria. This first question is for Carol. Could you provide an example of effective training management per the process management framework in an environment that's often changing?
Sure, great question. So, keeping training flexible enough that you can keep up with these changes is a reasonable question, and something we all face together, right? So really understanding what knowledge is required, what's the experience of your target size audience, and using learning methods that allow you that flexibility. So videos, e-learnings, modularized learning components. Those are all things that allow you sort of a higher level of flexibility in making those changes, but really focusing on content that has changed versus a complete retraining of a given process. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Carol. Mike, there are several questions that came in about the tying of the KPIs to the processes and management review of them. Can you speak a little bit more to the specifics about how to align your CTQs and your KPIs to your processes, how you select them, how you tie them, and how often you should be reviewing them?
Yeah, I'll give that a shot. There's a couple questions in there, but we covered a little bit of that today, and I really think that there needs to be some rigor around how we do that. So a suggestion would be to go back to that SIPOC diagram we started with, and start with the outputs that are in that SIPOC diagram. For example, an updated source text of a label could be an output of a process for end-to-end labeling, and who is the customer of that output, and what are his or her requirements. So I think that clearly for me is a place to start when we think about business process owners owning a process that produces an output that is received by the customer, to work with that customer and with the regulatory requirements and capture those, as we covered, the definition of the metric, the target of the metric, and then the frequency of review. Generally, the frequency of review is dictated by how often the process cycles, but by that I mean how often the process produces outputs. The more process cycles or produces outputs, perhaps the more frequent we should review it. However, generally, what we've seen is this notion of monthly, quarterly reviews, where at a process level, we will be interested in monthly reviews of certain metrics that boil up to more of a senior quarterly management review. The idea of CTQ from Six Sigma, critical to quality, I see that as synonymous with the customer requirement. If we know how to develop a CTQ, the Six Sigma folks would tell us we go to the customer, get the voice of the customer, and translate it to a critical to quality element. So that element of Six Sigma, that development of a CTQ, to me is identical to identifying a critical compliance metric or a quality metric or a cost metric.
Thanks, Mike. Odette, a question for you. Can you speak to who should be involved in process mapping and determining the need for change? And also, as part of that, could you explain how to determine your SMEs, including their general sort of level within the organization, and whether or not you need to include end users?
Thank you. The topic around the BPOs, generally in selecting your business process owners, you should look for experts within the process, and because it would lead to a lot of discussions and agreement in establishing the process, you want BPOs who are at the right leadership level in the organization so that you can move the topics and don't come up stuck in establishing the process. And in terms of recommendations for what to do if a BPO is holding up, you should determine a governance in how the processes are established. In that way, you have a clear escalation pathway. And that way, when you have to move on decisions, then the leader or the escalation pathway should then be used to help in that process workshop.
Thank you, Odette.
Worries.
Laura Lee, could you please provide some more examples of best practices that would best be contained within managed information? Specifically, do we need to include templates and forms that would be used as part of the execution of the QMS?
Okay. Hello. Yes, this type of documentation could be used as job aids. So you could even have checklists and things that the user will require to perform the activity, but they're not mandatory documents. This type of documentation, like the templates and examples of documents, are really best practices. So that type of information could be managed in a knowledge hub, so it's available to the users when they need to access it. We also have business technical documents which provide best practices or sometimes step-by-step instruction to users. So that could also be an example of managed documentation.
Thank you. Question for Mike, and actually I think probably for everybody, we all have some experience with this. Mike, can you start by describing how the framework would need to be applied differently at a small company versus a bigger company?
That's a great question. I'll chime in a little bit and allow others to do the same. That, by the way, that was the focus for a discussion at a June DIA meeting in San Diego, where we partnered with Avoca and addressed that very question: does one size fit all? And the answer is no. One size of a QMS does not fit all. The TransCelerate framework in the original concept paper has 4 foundational elements that Gloria covered. one of the foundational elements is called understanding the context, and it describes very nicely understanding your external and internal considerations. And so based upon the complexity of their number of programs, indication areas, global studies being taken place, you're going to have a flexible, a QMS that might be more rigorous or less rigorous when you consider those external and internal considerations. And I think that that is the question for many out there as to, you know, do we just take it off the shelf and plug it in? And I think the nice part of the TransCelerate clinical QMS framework is that it is intended to be flexible and adaptable when we consider those external considerations. I don't know if anyone else wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, maybe I just add there to what Mike said. It's really the case that your QMS should be fit for purpose, and that the controls you put in place are commensurate to the risks of your business. So I'm really assessing your current structure and current business processes to then look at the extent to which you implement the TransCelerate QMS.
And I'll just add that it is not all entirely system driven. So it is okay to have homegrown solutions if you're a smaller company and that's all that your resources allow, especially when you don't have as many people who need to access the QMS. It doesn't require the same level of lockdown, if you will, that a larger company might require.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have one or two more questions. So we received a question about the training of process updates and how you prove your end users are aware of the most recent update without having to train them every single time. Laura Lee, would you like to speak to that maybe?
Sure. So what you can have is Delta training. So you can provide the training to the users, but you can provide an opt-out. So if they test proficiently on the material, you can provide a quiz. If they score a certain percentage, we'll throw out 90% or higher, then they are considered to already understand the material, so they could test out for that portion. Carol, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I was going to answer in the same way, right? Utilizing knowledge checks and focusing on content that has been revised or modified. And should the knowledge checks show that retraining is required, then it would launch sort of a broader retraining.
Thank you.
Well, Mary, I guess something else that I would add in there, and we glanced over it today. We used the term metadata a few times, and characterizing our processes through mapping and modeling. I think some of the aspiration for us is to do very much that, is to at an activity and role level characterize our processes and make sure there's associated metadata there, so that in the future we can get to more tailored training, not just give it to everybody, but give it to those where their activity was changed based upon their role. I think we're aspiring to get to that place, but we're not quite there. But I think there's a lot of benefit in that goal, and the framework that we're laying out helps us get there.
Thanks, Mike. So the last question that I have, which I'll start with Odette, but I think probably everybody might have something to add, is the question came in generally around how you oversee your QMS when you have outsourced studies. And I think maybe we want to answer that specifically around how you manage the processes and determining who's doing what and how well it's being done when you have an outsourced study.
Yeah, how I would approach that is really using the methodology we're proposing here through the process management framework is by really going back to look at the risks associated with that process or with that vendor. And based on that, you would know how much controls and oversight needs to be put in place to oversee that particular vendor. So I would look at the compliance history there, look at the complexity around the vendor management, what type of vendor that is, and then the operational risk. And based on that, I would be able to have the controls as needed.
Thanks, Odette. I think.
I just, yeah, go ahead, Mary.
No, I just want to chime in to say that I agree that it's key to make sure that you're looking at the risk associated with your vendor in addition to looking at the risk associated with your process there.
Yeah, I was just going to mention too that the TransCelerate clinical QMS framework, one of the elements is partnering. So, as a sponsor, we have responsibility clearly, and so the QMS and the element called partnering also helps to make sure there's appropriate oversight.
And you also want to make sure that you've identified the process, measures, and controls. So if the CRO is managing something, you want to do those checks to make sure they are providing what you're requesting.
Thank you all. Gloria, that concludes the questions.
All right, great. We have two quick poll questions then for the folks who are still on the line. So thank you again for attending our webinar today. If you can answer the poll question that's going to be launched. The first question here is, will the materials presented here today be helpful to you in your organization's process management activities? So if you can quickly answer that poll, we would appreciate it. And again, we will be sending the links out in a day or two with the recording and the materials and links to the website. So it looks like about 53% of the folks on the phone have voted so far. So we'll leave that open for a couple more seconds. All right, looks like we're at about 60%. So you can go ahead and close that and then share the results. So thank you. It looks like 35% said definitely yes, 49% said likely yes, and 12% sounds like they're not sure, they need to take a closer look. So again, we'll send those out in the next day or two. And then our last polling question is, if you can let us know how much value the webinar provided to you today. Was it no value, a little value, moderate value, or a lot of value? And again, this will help us plan additional webinars in the future. And we'll leave that open for a few more seconds. Thank you for voting. And we'll go ahead and close that, I think, Heather. And looks like 20% a little value, 48% moderate value, and 31% a lot of value. Great, thank you very much for providing that feedback. So again, please visit our website and we'll be sending the materials out. So thanks again, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.